a CCTV piece about the Chinese Air Force, which should be considered a promotional video. Then it exposed the GJ11 and J20 cooperative operations. There were also scenes of the Hongqi 20 launching. Let's first talk about this exposure. What's quite shocking is the cooperative combat between the GJ11, the J16, and the J20. When we talk about the GJ11 project, we have to mention the American X-47B, which appeared around the same time. The American X-47B actually had its first test flight earlier than our GJ11 demonstrator. And after its test flight, in terms of technical maturity, the American X-47B was actually ahead of the GJ11 demonstrator. We can see here that the X-47B had already successfully taken off and landed on the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier in 2013. And in 2015, it had already achieved aerial refueling with a KC-707 tanker. The main reason the US designed the X-47B was largely because, at the time, they wanted to operate far from the Chinese coastline, deploying long-endurance, all-aspect stealth UAVs to strike the targets in China's shallow depth. At that time, its primary target for striking China's shallow depth was mainly the DF-21, because the anti-ship variant of the DF-21 has a range of only about 1,700 kilometers. At that time, the X-47B's range could reach about 4,800 kilometers, so it could take off from an aircraft carrier more than 2,000 kilometers away from the Chinese coastline. And the X-47B could search for and then strike the DF-21 seconds in China's shallow depth. However, with the 2015 September 3rd military parade, China unveiled the new DF-26. This anti-ship ballistic missile, the DF-26, has a far greater range than the DF-21. In that situation, the DF-26 could be launched from positions much deeper within China to strike U.S. carrier strike groups. The range of the DF-26 is at least more than twice that of the DF-21. In that scenario, for the X-47B to penetrate 1,000 kilometers into Chinese territory to search for the DF-26 became very unrealistic. Even though the X-47B is stealthy, it still cannot achieve optical invisibility. Furthermore, the X-47B is not an exceptionally fast or highly maneuverable aircraft. Once it penetrates deep into Chinese inland areas, it is easily shot down. And it's not just the problem of penetrating too deep, being easily detected and shot down. Once it enters Chinese airspace over 1,000 kilometers inland, its communications would also become a very significant problem. Due to the appearance of the DF-26, the X-47B project was eventually cancelled. As we now know, the X-47B project evolved into the MQ-25 tanker project. It was stillborn. The GJ11, developed concurrently with the American X-47B, had its test flight around 2013. We can see that the GJ11 that test flew in 2013 was still equipped with a Russian RD-93 engine. Moreover, the facility responsible for reverse engineering the RD-93 at that time was in Guizhou. At that time, reverse engineering the RD-93 due to limited technical capabilities. In 2013, Guizhou's reverse engineering of the RD-93 was following the 5 comparisons method. The 5 comparisons means to be completely identical, including processes and materials, to the original RD-93. At that time, Guizhou did not yet have the capability to produce a non-afterburning version of the RD-93. So, in the end, during the Lijian test flight, an original Russian RD-93 was used, and it was the afterburning version. By the 2019 military parade and subsequent Zhuhai air shows, the GJ11 we saw did not have an EOTS device on its nose. But in this recently exposed video of the GJ11, it's very clear that it now has an EOTS device, an integrated electro-optical targeting system. Let's look at its video. I muted the background music. In this picture, we can clearly see that the GJ11 has a very distinct all-aspect EOTS integrated optical device on the front. This is different from the GJ11 exposed during the 2019 parade and previous Zhuhai air shows. Previously, if the exposed GJ11 had no EOTS, it could basically only detect targets using passive methods, or rely on other friendly aircraft to provide target designation for it to strike the enemy. In that situation, it was actually very disadvantageous for autonomous strikes. But in this CCTV video, the GJ11 has EOS, giving it the ability to actively search for the enemy. Furthermore, the GJ11's exhaust nozzle has been well treated. It's a non-afterburning engine. The GJ11 with EOTS can not only find targets itself and strike the enemy, it will itself become a very good node for situational awareness on the battlefield. In the video, we can see that the GJ11 arrives at the designated position first. Then, the rear contacts the J20, informing it of the GJ11's position. After that, the J20 and GJ11 coordinate. This is quite normal because for a fighter jet, after all, its size is relatively limited. Its communication antennas are relatively limited, and the number of targets it can communicate with is itself limited. The GJ11 itself is an all-aspect stealth aircraft. In this situation, airborne early warning platforms or ground command platforms, which serve as command centers for campaign-level operations, have many communication nodes. After the GJ11 reaches its designated station, it informs the J20, and then the J20 coordinates with the GJ11. This ensures the J20 is less likely to be detected on the battlefield. Because even with directional communication, if your electromagnetic signals are not strictly managed on the battlefield, they are easily detected. For stealth aircraft, besides shape stealth, very strict electromagnetic management is also crucial. When coordinating, the GJ11 can not only provide situational awareness and ground attack capabilities near the J20, it can actually venture out quite far ahead of the J20, providing situational awareness deeper into enemy territory. Why could the GJ11 project continue while the X-47B project was stillborn? A key reason is that the battlefield environments of the US and our country are different. For the US to strike targets in China, it needs to penetrate deep into Chinese territory. China, besides having a large land area, also has great strategic depth. But for the GJ11, if it ventures out to strike US targets, the US ultimately aims to contain China within the first and second island chains. All of its bases there have very shallow depth. The area with the greatest depth among them is probably Japan and the Philippines. The Philippines' infrastructure conditions are really too poor. Deploying heavy forces in the Philippines is actually not very suitable. Japan has better infrastructure conditions. Deploying heavy forces in Japan is a key position for containing China's advance beyond the first and second island chains. But we also see that whether it's Japan or South Korea, their depth is actually very shallow. For the GJ11, it actually doesn't need to penetrate too deep into the enemy's territory to operate, because the enemy lacks depth. As for islands like Guam and Hawaii in the Pacific, they are even smaller, which is even less of a problem for the GJ11. This is quite important. The main reason our country's GJ11 project could continue, while the US X-47B project was stillborn. Let's first answer some questions about the GJ11. Quantum asked, what is its combat radius? The combat radius of the GJ11 has not been announced by the state. The GJ11 is quite different from traditional fighter jets. Traditional fighters actually don't spend much time loitering over the battlefield. For the GJ11, long-term loitering over the battlefield is meaningful. Currently, it seems the GJ11's combat radius is at least not inferior to the J20's. But as for range, it should greatly exceed the J20's, because the GJ11 needs to loiter for long periods over the battlefield. Hu Jinlin calls it Zhuanlong. It should have air combat capability, can launch air-to-air missiles. It can definitely launch them. However, look, the GJ11's engine has no afterburner. For a fighter jet launching an air-to-air missile, the missile's range varies tremendously depending on the launch altitude and speed. It can definitely launch, but if you expect the GJ11 to engage in air combat, it's actually not very suitable. Quantum, can the GJ11 go supersonic? The GJ11 definitely cannot go supersonic. First, its engine has no afterburner. Second, its configuration cannot fly supersonically. A FUD. Does the GJ11 have no radar and can only be an arsenal plane? The GJ11 has a passive radar. You can't say it has no radar at all. And it's not just an arsenal plane. It has that EOTS integrated optical device on the front, which can also serve a situational awareness role on the battlefield. Quantum. Can a single-seat J20 control the GJ11? Definitely no problem. Actually, the GJ11 has quite strong autonomous flight capability. It doesn't require the J20 to manually control it. However, the decision to strike after detecting the enemy is made by the J20, or the rear base, or the J16 or AWACS. As for when to launch weapons, at what altitude, and from which position, that is actually decided by the GJ11 itself. It's not a crewed drone like that. Suber calls it Xuanlong, seems to have no forward fire control radar, but has EOTs. Mainly for land and sea attack, right? Right, the GJ11 is mainly for land and sea attack. Lee, is the GJ11's weapons bay the same size as the J20's? More or less, basically about the same size as the J20's. Jif Bizu, how far apart can the GJ11 and J20 operate from each other? A few hundred kilometers apart is no problem. Farther than that might not work well, because for aircraft like the J20 and GJ11, our country currently uses phased array methods for communication. With phased array methods, the electromagnetic waves are more easily concentrated in one direction. Actually, the communication range is limited by the Earth's curvature, not by insufficient signal strength from the aircraft. If relying on ground control, the control range for the GJ11 would be relatively limited, because for a highly stealthy aircraft like the GJ11, when entering the battlefield, it's best not to fly too high. Fly low instead. If you fly high, you can't always assume the enemy is incompetent, right? You have to consider the enemy has some capability. The enemy, through radar networks or high-power radar, can still detect you. In that case, try to minimize your flight altitude. That greatly reduces the probability of the enemy's radar detecting you. But if you rely on ground control and the GJ11 cannot fly too high, it's affected by the Earth's curvature. So currently, for the GJ11, airborne communication mainly relies on whether it's our relays, direct communication with the J20, or communication with AWACS. It mainly communicates with these platforms, not ground command posts. Because of communicating with ground command posts, the GJ11's range would be very limited. Of course, for exported versions of the GJ11, if you operate them like that, it doesn't matter.